Welcome, COD fans, to what we're calling the Call of Duty Mobile Roundtable. Spoiler alert, there's no table, and if there was one, it probably wouldn't be round. On my whole shift, with me, I've got the legendary, illustrious, and relatively handsome Bobby Plays. I've also got Hippo with me, and of course, the now Indian COD Mobile sensation, Tectonic. Gents, starting with Mr. Bobby Plays, how we feeling, my guy?
I'm feeling good. I'm excited to get COD Mobile esports action up and running. It's been a little bit of a dry spell, but there's a lot to talk about and a lot that's getting started up in the month of March. So it should be a lot of fun.
Should be a lot of fun. Giga Brain Hippo, legendary coach, all-star dresser. What are we feeling?
Yeah, no, I think, same sentiment as Bobby. Overall, I think we're just going to have an incredibly exciting season. There's so much to look forward to, and a lot of announcements that have been made about the changes that are going to happen in COD Mobile as a whole. So super excited to talk about all of this.
Tech, the one pro player here on the board. Bobby didn't qualify, so it's just you?
I mean, I didn't qualify either if we're talking about that, man.
Is that true?
Bobby made it further than me, bro.
I tried to get Tech. I actually talked to Tech when we were streaming together, and I said, if we make it to the next stage of the competition, like, how much do I have to pay you for you to join Bobby Bucket's Dino Nuggets? But unfortunately, we never reached that point.
It's a legendary team name, by the way. It's a legendary team name. Let's just kind of kick the conversation off because Season 6 obviously is all right in the forefront of our minds. We've got global action starting up. And with that, every year we always look at a brand new map pool. And I kind of want to start with that. Maps that are out, new maps that are in. Hippo, I kind of want to go to you first on this one. How do we feel about, let's just start with the Hardpoint map pool. How do we feel about Summit, Hacienda, Apocalypse, Arsenal, Slums?
Oh my, I think that there's a lot of, kind of old memories flooding back in. There's a lot of nostalgia in some of the previous seasons, such as, Slums coming back in. But we also see some mainstays that are, still sticking around, such as Summit and also Apocalypse from last season. So I think it's an incredibly interesting map pool, especially now that we have some iconic maps that are back in, while also having some maps that, have been notoriously known to be both strengths for certain Eastern teams and then strengths for Western teams in terms of performances across the board at major international events such as Masters and in the World Championship last year. So overall, I think it's a super exciting map pool. It seems to be very, very balanced in terms of just the size of the map pool as a whole, pretty relatively stable across the board with a couple exceptions just here and there. So I think but I think there are the nuances of the map that every team is going to want to explore to see, what is going to be their strengths and weaknesses across the board. So it'll be super fun to see how the hardpoints pan out.
How about you guys? Bobby, Tech, Hardpoint map pool, what are we feeling?
You go ahead, Tech.
I hate Summit, man. I will die on this hill, bro. I'm an AR playing Summit. Why? Why is this in the map pool? Look, Summit has some of the worst spawns, in my opinion, until they came out with this new map pool. Because the Arsenal spawns and the Slum spawns, they have no consistency whatsoever. So I enjoy the maps, but I'm looking forward to the spawns points kind of getting reworked. But yeah, I removed Summit.
I know from what I've heard, obviously I play the game, but Arsenal Hardpoint is not in ranked, and we never really scrimmed it whenever we were getting ready for SPS. So Arsenal was just like a permaban for us because from what we had heard, the spawns were definitely still an issue there. So hopefully we do get a little bit of a rework before the main portion of the season comes up. But I enjoyed the rest of them. I wish we would have gotten to play Slums more because I feel like that's a really underrated hardpoint map. I know the spawns can get wonky at some points, but for the most part, that's one that I really enjoy the flow of. So overall, I like it. I'm glad that they added Hacienda back in as well. That's one that I think was definitely missing for last season, and is just such a good. Actually, was Hacienda in the last season?
It was.
It was? Okay. Maybe we just didn't get to see it quite as much, but Hacienda is definitely one that I guess maybe because I don't ever play it in rank, going back to that was definitely a lot of fun to play.
Fair. Search and Destroy is the interesting one, I think, this year for the map pool because Tunisia, staple. Firing range, staple. Standoff, staple. Kurohana returns. Coastal gets added. And I know that Coastal has been a staple of the Eastern Hemisphere in a lot of their events, but now we're going to see it globally. Any thoughts about Coastal being added into the map pool for the first time in the Western space?
You can wall bang.
I think
everything,
Coastal's
bro.
really good. Oh, go ahead, take.
You can just wall bang everything on that map, bro. It's unreal.
Fair enough.
It's a good map. I like it.
I like it as a map. I think the flow of it's good. I think it is very balanced on both sides and never really felt like it was super one-sided on offense or defense. So I really like the flow of it. I wish we would have seen maybe a couple more changes because I think it was only one map that really got changed for the Search and Destroy map pool, but I think Coastal was a good addition as far as what the possible options were.
Hippo?
I think with Coastal, it's definitely a good map. I think even though on the competitive side, we've seen a lot of Eastern teams get to play it, it has been in the ranked pool for quite a bit of time now for Search and Destroy. So I think that, players who have played S&D in ranked are going to be somewhat familiar to this. So I don't think we can necessarily count out the Western Hemisphere altogether in terms of familiarity. But at the very least, this does make it so that now the East has a map at the very least in the early season where they're going to have a distinct advantage over the West. But the overall design of the map, I agree, is fairly balanced. My personal take is that it's slightly leaning towards defense, but I think it is one of the more balanced maps overall, for sure.
I think that, looking at the map pool, the one that I always kind of selfishly root for is Express to be involved. It's an absolute classic. I know that there is some cheese that comes with it, but I love the map. So a little interesting to not see it be a part of the year this year. And then Control, Raid, Takeoff, we know those. Crossfire, just out of nowhere. What do we feel about Crossfire? Bobby, you got a smirk on your face as wide as Texas.
We very intentionally did not play Crossfire either, just because I haven't heard good things about it. I think it suffers from a lot of the problems that we had with last year's Control map additions. And really, I think the biggest thing that needs to be addressed with the addition of Control maps is the tweaking of spawns before they make their way into the competitive map pool. I think part of the reason that 2 years ago it worked as well as it did is because we did actually get some changes to the spawn points for Standoff and for Raid. Not as much for Crossroads, but still less spawn trap heavy than the addition of Seaside and Arsenal. And from what I've seen, it is a lot of the same issue with Crossfire as well. Crossfire just in general across the community is not what I would consider a beloved map because it's kind of toxic for the majority of game modes. So that's one that I anticipate we probably won't see a whole lot in the competitive season.
Hippo, thoughts from a strategic standpoint?
Yeah, I think that Crossfire is a map that has been notorious. I've seen the East actually play this at some point with regards to Control specifically, if I recall correctly. I know that the Chinese teams played it before, and I know at the same time that in the early seasons of CDM, if I recall correctly, the very beginning. And, it was used in Search and Destroy, and there's a lot of nostalgia from back then. But as a Control map, it's just very awkward because of the fact that there are some very distinctly strong choke points that exist in the map that allow for some really, really disgusting spawn traps to happen. It's honestly worse than Seaside that's just my humble take when it comes to spawn trapping ability. If you're just able to get a control of certain places in the map, then you're kind of golden. You're just taking out 10 lives just independently from that. So
Tech, have you felt those things from the player perspective? Do you feel like there's just natural spots that just become almost impassable?
I'm gonna be honest. This map was in the map pool the 1 year I lost the regionals, so it's not looking good this year, But actually playing the map, I feel like this map for Control in particular is actually really good. The only thing that is bad in my opinion is obviously the spawns, because if someone, let's say if everyone was to push A, someone just leaks through the deli side, they get in your spawn, you're gonna spawn in front of them no matter what. There's no split spawns that'll put you inside of a building or something. for some sort of cover, like no matter what, I feel like Control needs a rework for spawns in particular. But the map itself, I feel like it's pretty well balanced. You could understand where everyone's going. You have to use utilities and maximize it to the most in order to get to where you want to go. It's not something where you just brain dead run through and like it's gonna work.
That's totally
I think
fair.
I think at the very least with this map, like there's going to be a lot of complaints about the map because of the fact that people are getting spawn trap all the time due to the design of the spawn itself. However, what I think is really good about this map, and the one upside that I personally like over Seaside and honestly over most of the maps in this pool, is that it really tests the fundamentals and basics on both on individual level in terms of a player, because there's so many spots that you have to constantly be checking, so many corners, so many places you can get sniped from, and so you have to be constantly looking for all of these, making sure that you use your utilities at the right points and at the right places, that you throw your smokes, etc., at the right spots. But then the second thing is, as a team, just having just the basic good macro of Control, just being able to make sure that you cover your lanes, you don't get too heavily focused on one side, because if you do, then you can allow for a leak to happen that allows for these really bad spawn traps to happen. So
now, this is kind of an off-the-wall topic of conversation to follow up on this, but I think it's intriguing, so why not just throw it out there, see what you guys have to say. Over the last handful of years, I think we all have come to grips with having only 3 maps in Control. There typically is always one that we love. There's always one that we typically hate. And it often kind of leads to conversations about the integrity of the game mode as a whole. Now, if we were to go back into the history of like competitive Call of Duty, Capture the Flag has always been kind of a massive staple of like old school CODs. How do you think a game mode like Capture the Flag would maybe do better, do worse, not maybe do anything different in terms of being a potential third competitive mode instead of Control? Bobby?
I think the chaotic nature of COD Mobile would make it tougher for Capture the Flag, just because you have 5v5, you have operators, you have so many different types of utility. I feel like that would be a difficult one to add in. And then on top of that, there's not necessarily like another game mode outside Capture the Flag that there's a good point of comparison. So from the perspective of the casual fan base, that it would take a lot more time for them to understand as compared to Control. It's basically like a combination of like Dom and TDM, that type of thing. From a competitive aspect, I don't think it would be unenjoyable to watch. I think it would just be a very big jump for both the players and the viewers to actually understand it well and understand it from a competitive standpoint.
Interesting. Follow-up thoughts? Agree, disagree, boys?
Techie, you have some thoughts first?
The more that I'm just like thinking about it, the more it's kind of just like, how would this work in a 5v5 environment? Because most of, CODs is 4v4. Just thinking of it, and also like how spawns have always been throughout like CODM so far. You're just gonna group spawn on whatever you're supposed to. So if like you have to spawn by the flag, how is an enemy team, supposed to get the flag if all 5 are spawning on it anyways? It's like, how would that work? How would that be adjusted? And you could also like, since it is 5v5, you put someone in the back of the spawn, you never have to worry about the flag. It's just like leave the other 4 to kind of handle the rest. It's like I don't feel like the whole team would be naturally involved into it like how a Control is. So I mean, I'd be interested to see how it would work, but I don't think it would be as good for competitive as Control currently.
Yeah, I think off that sentiment, I want to say I'm playing the devil's advocate, but I'm also not. I think it really depends on the map pool to a certain extent. For one, because I think that there are certain maps that I think would force the players to be a little bit more. There would be a bit more engagements due to the fact that the maps are naturally small. To be fair, like every single one of these maps that we have in the game are not technically built for a 5v5 environment. They're technically speaking, historically built for a 4v4 environment. However, there are certain maps where I think, the chaos and also the size of it makes it so that we are forced to have engagements, even if someone's just sitting back, just defending the flag, right? Such as, Summit, namely, for example, that would potentially make it so that we have to have this happen. So I think on the flip side as well, the chaotic nature of COD-M, whether it be because of the fact that there's additional players on both sides, in particular, and also operators, makes it so that I think it'll be a very unique and much more enjoyable and kind of flashy, and really cool to watch. Granted, from a casual perspective, I totally agree with the sentiment that it might be difficult for casual people to be able to relate to the game mode, but I think that is somewhat to a degree dependent also on whether or not this will be a game mode that is actually released in the rank modes and or at least for some kind of casual play. Because one of the big, I think, qualms that we kind of have as a whole, I think everybody would agree, is Control is a bit in and out as a ranked mode, and it was very late in terms of its introduction into the pool in the first place, which made it so it's kind of hard for people to even connect with the game mode despite the distinct similarities that it had. Right. So I think if they were to do this, it would take time to build up the player base to be like, hey, this is what Capture the Flag is. Of course, old COD maniacs, would all be, very, very much, they would recognize this and be like, oh, crap, this is pretty cool. But, everybody else, I think, who are coming into COD Mobile as their first COD title, I think they would need that kind of nudge, to be like, hey, this is Capture the Flag.
We also just got Control added as a permanent rank mode a month ago, so I'm kind of okay, yeah. We finally have an opportunity for the player base to actually understand how this works and everything else. So I'm very content to keep Control and let them keep refining the mode. Hopefully, the addition of it as a permanent mode into rank could also give them some more motivation to adjust the spawns a little bit more for those maps that are in the competitive mode and give them some more data to work with just to better understand how to make it flow better specifically for COD Mobile.
It's a really good point. It's just really interesting to hear all three of you guys say that Control is easier to understand because in the traditional COD sense, everyone's like, Control is way more difficult to understand than Capture the Flag. But I think the chaos of 5v5, I think you guys are absolutely right. I know that conversation has been one we've had kind of casually over the last handful of years, and it just, with the certain maps and how many players are on the field, it can get a little messy. One more kind of final question on the map pool before we can kind of swip away from this. And this is something that I personally feel pretty strongly about. But we're now getting into year 3 of forcing only individual maps to be played for specific modes. And I think at times we've had certain maps be labeled with a certain mode and it doesn't really feel right. Whereas we have maps like Raid, which feels great on every single mode. Do you guys feel one way or the other about how a map can only be played in one particular mode? Or do you feel more towards the side of allow there to be 7 total maps and you can play them across any different mode instead of having, what we have now, which is 13 individual map mode combinations?
Heck, you're the player. I'll let you go first.
Okay. For me personally, I enjoyed that they have different maps for each mode. And I only say this because I also watch a lot of the CDL and everything else. And they have it similar to where it's you have multiple maps. They all kind of go to each mode, but then you get something even up in the grand final yesterday, vault. It's yep. I enjoy the you have to actually practice other maps, and you can't just be so limited to one. Where it's if you look at Surge, they were really good at Protocol, but you ban Protocol, and then it's not really in their ballpark anymore. So I enjoyed that COD-M has that versatility to it.
Okay.
I do also think that COD-M has a lot more good competitive maps to work with than the CDL does as well. So I think the idea of having 7 maps in there allows for a little bit more specialization, I guess, just because teams wouldn't necessarily be able to and maybe you would adjust the ban system based on that as well. But you have teams that can't just ban out their one bad map and then they learn how to play all the rest. You're forced to master a larger number of maps, or at least become more specialized in those maps to kind of have fewer weak points in your game. So I feel just because COD Mobile does have all of the best competitive maps of all time across all Call of Duties, I think it could work really well to have repeating maps. Like you said, raid is good for every single mode right now. Standoff's good for pretty much every single mode. Like there's a few different ones that I would like to see in multiple modes, and I think having raid restricted, just because it's such a good map, having it restricted to only control, it does sometimes feel like its presence is missing in those other modes.
What do you think, Hippo?
Yeah. It's it's kind of weird because it's hard to. I think it'll be very awkward if we just like had those maps that we know are good for every single mode be like the only ones that are shared across each of the modes. I think it's kind of good, like, especially because that would just make the banning system, like pick ban system, kind of complicated to a degree. I mean, not that people can't figure it out, but I think it is more so like we don't want. I don't know how welcome the competitive community would be to that kind of, I suppose, hybrid to a certain degree. I think it's pretty much, defaulting to either we're all in on 7 maps and just, spread across each of the modes, or 13. My personal preference is just on like having these 13 maps, just because of the fact that I think from a viewership standpoint as well, and also from a competitive standpoint, it really forces teams to not just be, solid on like a certain set of maps. They actually have to be able to play each of these maps to a very, decently high degree, which makes it so that the game is, a bit more difficult. So I would say it kind of just depends on differing perspectives. Like if you're thinking about making it so that teams are better raised, and like that disconnect between like players who are in the lower level tier right now in terms of their gameplay and trying to knock on the door of becoming professionals, like perhaps it is better to, and on an esports perspective, to be able to make it so that we have less maps, so that players can just focus on actually working on each of those maps, and makes it so that there's less of a barrier of entry for them to get to that point. But if we're strictly just talking about like at the top level of competition, I think having these 13 maps is probably the better way to go, comparative to just having like 7 maps. So I think those are very separate issues in a sense.
Again, it's an intriguing
I do not
conversation
want to
point.
play Crossfire Hardpoint. I'm gonna just
Well,
just throw that out there now.
Like I get you on that 100%.
Totally valid. Okay, let's swap off the map conversation because we spent some good time on there. Let's start talking about how the meta has molded and changed, and how there's been a recent upticking of SMG gameplay, I feel like, across COD Mobile right now. How do you guys currently feel? Tech is hating his life right now. Let's just start with you, Tech. How do you feel about the current meta? And I guess first and foremost, I guess we should probably give us a little bit of a rundown of like what you're experiencing right now as the current meta.
Tech, I'm so sorry.
I hate this meta. Personally, I'm not saying I hate the meta just because I'm an AR player. I mainly hate the meta because we are becoming too accustomed into a 2-tap meta, and like we're constantly banning these mags that limit the 2-tap, 3-taps, but then we're allowing the guns that, push it for that. So you're like your Odin, the USS-9, the SKS, the Type. It's like, we don't want to use the mags, but we're allowed to use the guns. It's kind of like counterintuitive, if you ask me. And then I don't see a reason in the world why a SMG is outgunning me at 50 meters. And I have an Odin, Like, that's a red flag to me. If I could make like the meta kind of similar for comp, I would do something like your Type 19 and then like your Finnick. But I know COD wants to keep that kind of like versatility. But in the meta right now, you're still going to see probably like 2-3 the same guns. Like it's not going to change, and it's all going to come down to, like, in my opinion, there's luck to this at the end of the day, because you can hit 2 random shots and you're going to kill whoever. And it's not really like skill where it's like aim based or anything like that.
Interesting. Bobby, from the content side, I'm sure it's
Yeah,
probably
I mean, it's
your
a
YouTube
similar
channel.
Experience. Like and that's the thing. The USS is more powerful than like any weapon in the game. So it's not just like, oh, it's just better than all the non-restricted guns. Like, it's better. Effectively, if the USS is not going to have its damage attachment restricted, like, at this point, we should just unban all of the other attachments. Like, there's no reason for DRH OTM to be banned. It's not any better than the USS. No reason for HVK large cal to be banned. It's not any better than the USS. So I think the restrictions definitely need to be refined, or just unban everything and let people play with whatever they want. Because like Tech said, you unban the SKS and you unban the Type 63. So you have like all these conversion mags that are now restricted, like for the A mags and the Type 19. None of those are better than the SKS and the Type 63. So I think you just unban all the attachments that are not explosive attachments. Like I think you still keep the explosive related ones out, but if the USS is going to stay in there, then might as well give the ARs a little bit more of an opportunity to compete, given how strong that it is right now.
Hippo, thoughts? See you
so I think I have a bit of a. So I have similar yet also like polar opposite sentiments also here because it's funny. Just yesterday I did a podcast. And talking about the metagame. And when I was doing a tier list for weapons, specifically within competitive, the only weapon that I put in the meta-defining tier was the USS-9. Every other weapon, in terms of ARs, I put equally as strong because of the fact that if you look at the Western Hemisphere versus the Eastern Hemisphere, you'll see differences in principles and differences in playstyles, where teams that are trying to play a bit more fast and aggressively will opt to play for Type 19s, XM4s. Meanwhile, for teams that are, playing a little bit more control and kind of more strictly structured types of playstyles, you'll see teams that are trying to use the Odin. And, I think there's a lot of debate about like the ARs and their strengths and weaknesses, which makes it so that I think on the purely in terms of ARs, there's a bit of a healthy metagame to a certain extent in terms of there is room for discussion and that there is room for why something is used over the other. However, USS independently being the only SMG and the fact that its potential makes it so that it's able to be used across all ranges is unhealthy. I definitely agree with that sentiment, and I also do agree that like if the USS Mag is allowed to be used, because of the fact that if we objectively look at it comparative to some of the other restricted items right now, whether it be flat out just weapons or just attachments, like the USS outclasses a number of these as well, to be fully honest. And so on that perspective, I do think that there are certain things that should be either it should get banned, which I think is the easier answer, the mag itself getting banned, or unban everything else, which that just means all hell breaks loose right there. And I think which could be
hell is already broken loose. We got the USS.
But yeah, I think the metagame for everything else except SMGs is pretty healthy right now to a certain degree. I think the question that kind of stems from this, which I would like to pitch in the air, is if the USS Mag is banned, then would we want to see the Odin being banned as well? Because of the fact that, or like the SKS / Type 63 getting the ban for that getting reverted. Because if the qualm is about the issue of the time to kill over a very long range, being so fast, then it's more than just the USS. There's effectively 4 weapons at the very least that are all in that similar boat, right?
I would agree. I think there just needs to be more direction for the purpose of the weapon bans that exist in the game, because right now it kind of seems like a hodgepodge. It kind of feels like the SKS and Type 63 were unbanned to keep up with how broken the USS is, and I think the alternative route should be trying to get the meta into a more competitive place, because at the end of the day, like the faster the time to kill is, the less that skill actually plays a factor in the ability to win gunfights. So I think we should, if I were to make the changes, move the meta back in the direction of slowing down, because competitive is like the one place where the players can actually have a voice in what makes for a competitive meta. So even if the rest of the game is suffering from absurdly fast time to kill, you have ways that you can kind of mitigate that. And because it's easier to ban a weapon or attachment than it is to get it to get an actual balance patch pushed through, especially as far as COD-M standards, I think it's a lot more manageable and a lot more doable to make it a competitive environment.
Interesting. So you guys are kind of both in the same ballpark of you want to see the time to kill be extended by taking away the mag instead of going to everything being a faster time to kill by allowing the mags for the 2-tap SKS Lucas-in specials that we kind of had from a couple of years ago.
For sure.
Okay. Tech, you in the same ballpark? You want to see it extended time to kill wise, longer gunfights?
I just want to stop getting headshotted from across the map by an SMG. You know, there's no reason for that.
Okay, that's too funny. That's good to know. Okay, so that kind of sets up an interesting conversation point. You kind of touched this a little bit, Hippo, talking about like play style differences and how we've seen, you know, the East versus West conversation really take off in that direction, talking especially over the last year and a half, 2 years, where the Eastern play style has much more favored a more calculated, methodical, more patient kind of approach. Obviously, a lot more reps on search and destroy. Longer search and destroy maps have allowed that to kind of also develop, whereas in the West, it was a lot of the, when it was at the top, a lot of run it down, run and gun style. If you have better gun skill, you're going to win it out. It's going to be a lot of full floods. It's going to be a lot of just head bashing. Talk me more about kind of how over the last year, especially with this most recent COD Mobile Championships being dominated by Eastern teams, talk me more about how that dynamic has shifted and maybe even separated further, kind of looking at how the Eastern teams have built an identity that has been very successful compared to what the West was running with. And maybe Tech, just kind of starting with you, since you have experience in playing in both regions.
After traveling to India, you kind of, you know, you get into that mindset of like you're playing everyone. I feel like India was like the very best place to play from, mainly because you could play China, you could play Europe. I mean, if you wanted to play NA, your middle ground is Europe. You play Philippines, you play Japan. I think being there was like you're more involved into the competitive nature rather than NA. You know, you have LATAM. And nobody likes playing Europe in NA, I'm gonna be honest. Not good practice. And it's like, what are you supposed to do in the West? Like that's the real question. You play 1 year for one event, because maybe two, but over in the East, you know, they have the Chinese league, CDM, CDSI, CDFI. They have their own little Asian league. It's like it's more involved for the players, and the West just has not caught up to that whatsoever.
So you're saying more along the lines of the amount of opportunity has helped develop the East, maybe more so than the play style differences that inherently have been kind of created?
Yeah, so I think a big thing with the West is like they just want to be involved in something, but there's nothing for them to be involved in. You know, there's no incentive to like, oh, I want to play the game, like I want to be better, I want to compete versus these people. Like there's none of that in NA, and I've competed in NA for a long time. I can tell you nobody has that, for sure.
Bob, you want to follow up? I know because you had a little bit of a jump start with running your own opportunity, you know, with Mobile Mayhem, trying to get that off the ground and try to create more opportunities. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a number of different factors. I think the decrease in NA viewership following kind of their fall off, I would kind of say after 2022, that's contributed to the difficulty of running grassroots esports for COD Mobile, because at the end of the day, like viewership drives sponsors make tournaments possible. So if you don't have the funding to, number one, be able to provide prize pools, and number two, be able to actually hire staff, there's not really any way that you can run a successful league without funding directly from COD Mobile. So I think that combined with the cost of living, especially in North America, makes it really, really difficult for anybody to really consider themselves a pro player, which is why we've seen pro players go to other regions. Number one, because there's more esports support. Like I think especially as far as mobile gaming, there's not a lot of mobile orgs, or at least orgs that take mobile seriously. We've seen them see it as an opportunity to try to get some viewership, and then it hasn't panned out because COD Mobile Esports hasn't been thriving to the point where they thought it was going to be, and so they dip after a year or 6 months or whatever it is. So I think having that established league like you have in CDM, or like, I know that this is something that's going to be happening year round. I know this is something that is going to drive viewership to my brand, and they're willing to invest into players to actually give them the funding that they need to be able to play at the level they want to. But if you're all self-funded, like the majority of NA, the majority of EU, the majority of LATAM, and you've only got a couple tournaments a year that are not going to be able to provide enough for you to really make a living off of it unless you come in first place at the end of the World Championships, it's just really difficult to justify making it your full-time job. And that's why I think we've started to see, or we've really continued to see that gap grow between the East and the West is because, like Tectonic also said, like you're a little bit limited in who you can play against. But ultimately, the biggest factor is the funding and the backing, and none of the Western teams really have that right now.
Perfect segue to you, Hippo, as being, you know, a coach who's on the back end, more of the kind of managerial logistical side, not just in the individual playing base that we often obviously assume that we kind of talk about with the esports space. What's your thoughts on that whole dynamic?
Yeah, because I fully agree with both Bobby and Tech here, because, you know, I've worked with teams both in the East and the West, and the attitudes between them in terms of how willing they are in terms of to put in extra hours outside of the game and down the line. It's not just a matter of, I think there is a matter of willpower to a certain degree as well, but it's more so also, I think that comes, the root of it is just the culture. Because in the East, if I ask like players from Blacklist when I used to work with them to, you know, put in extra hours into the game, I mean, some of them do streaming, some of them do actually, you know, are proactive about this, and they have a huge fan base, and there's multiple tournaments that are happening through Garena Masters that makes it so that they have a huge incentive. And as kind of Bobby pointed out, which I think is a massive point with regards to cost of living, for them being able to just, you know, run into it, like just win or just even place at a Garena Masters is pretty much sufficient for them to, regardless of their salary, to be able to actually just, you know, have a pretty decent living over in the Philippines, for example, comparative to in North America. If you took that amount of money, it wouldn't really mean much. You might not be even able to, you know, pay your rent, to be honest. And so just given that alone, I think, you know, it's very difficult to be able to grow teams in the West. You know, back when it was like 2022, 2020, like even up to maybe 2023, where the West was still thriving, you know, I was able to, you know, nag players like Techie here to, you know, to put in, you know, a little bit of extra work, but, you know, they still had to maintain their own living, which made it so that, you know, I couldn't get as much out of them as I wish I could in terms of whether it be extra hours or extra, you know, VODing or otherwise. But, you know, with the East now, you know, regardless of what team in the East that you ask, it's very different. It's just, this is their job, this is their work. You know, if you look at CDM, it's effectively a franchise, really. It's effectively a CDL to a certain degree, where they have these teams that are set. They're getting everything, you know, set for them in terms of housing, in terms of living, and otherwise their necessary expenses, and they're just getting paid to, you know, work and play COD Mobile and, you know, and study the game. And so it's a very, and same with over in the Philippines or wherever else in Garena, it's pretty much they get paid a good amount, enough for them to justify doing this as their life. But over here, you have teams, and I think that there's a lot of players that have so much potential, actually, that are still in the West. I mean, if you just look at Latin America, you have Glories, you have the players from Free Agents that are, you know, all phenomenally talented players and have a long history. Like, but then you also have in NA, I mean, Undream actually, you know, is a group of really talented players as well. But, you know, they just all can't get the support, and also, most importantly, they can't actually interact with the other play styles that have been dominating. Which, if we're going to reel it back to the play style discussion, you know, I think the part of the reason why the West can't actually keep up right now is because they're so restricted within each other, and they're all just imitations at best of the East. And, you know, but there's, and Tech can attest to this, there's a difference between actually playing the original, compared to playing someone that's trying to copy it, you know.
That's fair.
And so just from that alone, I think that makes it so that the kind of difference is only going to get bigger rather than smaller, as there's not much opportunity for Western teams to be able to actually interact with the Eastern teams, which is not just a matter of like server issues of not being able to, you know, experience, you know, playing against teams in Garena because of the fact that they're different, you know, apps and down the line, but it's also ping, making it so that it's so difficult, you know, when you have such large differences in ping and servers and down the line, like how can players feel A, like encouraged to actually play on that ping, but then B, simultaneously they feel like it's just, you know, are they actually feeling like they're actually getting something out of it when the ping is so high, right? Like is what they're actually doing working, or is it the ping that's working, right? In terms of winning their gunfights or not, so.
The age-old question when it comes to online Call of Duty. Trust me, that's not exclusive to mobile. Exactly. Let's just take the conversation to its kind of climactic and ending point here, and just reround all this conversation into what's immediately coming up with season 6, focusing, let's just use the Western region in a whole, whether you want to talk EU, NA, or Latin America. What are your guys' general expectations, not maybe just for each individual region, but how those regions in the Western Hemisphere in total may stack up this year comparatively to years prior against what is now the reigning champion in Elevate, and of course the rest of the Chinese teams that were rounding out our playoffs from last year? Bobby, what are you thinking about the West and each of the regions?
I mean, for the West, I'm really looking at, I guess now it's not LATAM, it's South America, as they've moved Mexico into North America. But I feel like LATAM are the region that do stand a realistic chance of developing to the point where they could be able to compete against those Eastern regions. I think they do have a lot of talent there, and I think a lot of it is just having the funding. They do have more time that they can actually spend putting time into the game. Galoris obviously going to be the team that everybody's looking at. They've been the kings of the LATAM region for a long time. It just didn't really translate to the main stage last year. And going back to the server issue, I know that it's really hard for them because they don't even get good ping against North American teams. So they're very isolated relative to the rest of the world, but there's a lot of talent there. I'm excited to see what they're going to be able to do in the upcoming season. And I think that's going to be probably the most well-rounded team, just because we have seen some of the talent dispersion from some of those NA and EU teams to go to other regions. LATAM is the one that's really stuck together, maybe because of language differences more than anything else, but I think that will serve them in the long run to be able to continue to grow and advance. And obviously, going back to the SKS and the Type 63 getting unbanned, the LATAM teams were the ones that were really dominating with that meta, so that could be a change that really favors them in the long run.
Tech, who are you looking at in the Western regions? Any teams you want to keep an eye on, whether it be EU, NA, or Latin America?
Yeah, I think Glories is a favorite no matter what out of the West. Inside of North America, I think there's probably two teams that are, worth mentioning. It's Undream and then the Seminole roster. Curious on how the Seminole roster is going to go, because I know you can do like roster changes and all. So it is possible they roster change. Like our team didn't, get through. So Jez and Marshy is also up for grabs. I could see them going to Seminole if anything was to happen. That would be, most reasonable.
Yeah, because I think Vague's on that team, but he's retired and playing on iPad. So I would not be surprised if they ended up picking up Marshy or Jez in his place, just because I also don't think that he wants to put a ton of time in as far as scrims. I could be wrong on that one, but I would not be surprised if they made that roster swap.
Yeah. And Europe, I'm going to be honest, Europe is just Europe. I like some of the people there, but like team-wise, man, I'm not really going to pay attention to Europe.
Dang, not high in the Frenchies, huh?
I love Marvel.
Hippo, what are you thinking? Who you got your eye on in the Western Hemisphere?
I mean, it's the same thing as what Bobby and Tech said. It's mostly just Glories, Undream, maybe Sentinel. I think, though, free agents, I think, is also worth mentioning as another, up-and-coming Brazilian team. They've shown that they can fight against Glories, maybe not necessarily, fully win a series yet, but they can, still put pressure on them, which I think, speaks volumes in terms of their ability and talent as a roster, for sure. And, so I'm just really excited to see, whether they're able to kind of dig through the trenches of being unfortunately put into the Western Hemisphere and in the ecosystem that they are in. But I don't think that it's impossible either. Just from the struggles that Glories had by themselves as is, they managed to get top 4 at the World Championship, which is nothing to scoff at by any means. So I think it'll be really cool to see them, keep pushing it, especially because now they've gone through one full year of being the same roster, but now they're pressing into year 2, and that difference is actually huge. Just 1 year versus 2 years of being together, actually.
100%. All right. Well, that's going to conclude our first episode of what we're calling the Call of Duty Mobile Roundtable. Spoiler alert, there is no table, and if we had one, it wouldn't be round. But that's Bobby, Tech, Hippo. I'm Shiv. Thanks for tuning in, and of course, enjoy Season 6. Bye-bye.